Field Marshal Shunroku Hata pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, what had, a few seconds earlier, been his study. He was 66 years old. He was the commander of the Second General Army, responsible for defending the entire southern half of the home islands of Japan against the American invasion that everyone knew was coming. He was one of the highest-ranking military officers in the empire. He was, at this moment, bleeding from his face and his hands. His uniform was in strips. The walls of his residence were gone. Above him, where a ceiling had been, there was only a sky the color of ash and a cloud rising in a shape he had no name for. He did not know what had just happened. He would not know for many hours. He was, though he could not have understood it in that moment, the highest-ranking military officer in human history to have survived a nuclear attack from a distance of about 2.5 miles. He stood up. He walked 430 miles to the north. In the capital of the empire he served, the 6 men who ran the war had not yet heard his name spoken that morning. They would not hear it for another 16 hours. This is the story of those 16 hours, and of the 4 years of self-deception that made them possible. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace in central Tokyo, a bunker had been carved out of the earth, 90 feet down. Reinforced concrete walls 4 feet thick. The Japanese called it the Obunko, the emperor's library shelter, but everyone who worked there knew it by another name. The room where the war would end, or where the war would end them. Inside that room, on the morning of the 6th of August, 6 men were preparing for another day of managed defeat. They called themselves the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War. History would call them the Big Six. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, 77 years old, a retired admiral with a bullet fragment still lodged near his heart from the failed coup of 1936. He walked slowly. He spoke slowly. He pretended to be deeper than he was. Everyone thought he was slipping into senility. Almost no one understood that his slowness was a strategy. The emperor had chosen him in April for one reason, and one reason only: to end the war, and to survive long enough to do it. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo, 63 years old, a career diplomat with a German wife. The only man in that room who would tell the generals the truth to their faces. Army Minister General Korechika, an army. 58 years old, a master swordsman, a childhood friend of the emperor from their days at the Piers School. He believed sincerely that Japan could still win. Or if not win, then die beautifully. Navy Minister Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, 65 years old. He had opposed the war since 1940. Now he sat across the table from the men who had ignored him and waited. Army Chief of Staff General Yoshijiro Umezu, 63 years old, former commander of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria, the man whose signature had authorized Unit 731, Navy Chief of Staff Admiral Soimu Toyoda, 60 years old, the man who had ordered the doomed defense of Leyte Gulf. 3 of them wanted the war to end. 3 of them wanted to fight until the last citizen was dead. And on that morning, as the sun rose over Tokyo, they did not know that the argument had already been decided for them by 3 American aircraft over a city they were not thinking about. Because none of them were thinking about Hiroshima. Hiroshima was where Field Marshal Hata had his headquarters. It was where he had woken that morning at his official residence in the eastern part of the city. It was where he had dressed, where he had eaten a small breakfast, where he was reading a report when the light came. He would later say it was like the sun had fallen through the ceiling. The blast wave that followed threw him across the room. When he opened his eyes, his residence was gone, the walls that had saved him gone. He was lying in a field of splinters that had been a house. He stood up, he walked. What he saw as he walked would become the first eyewitness account received by the Imperial General Headquarters. But it would not arrive for many hours, because Hiroshima had no telephones anymore. Hiroshima had no telegraph. Hiroshima had no radio. The city that housed the Second General Army the Japan Broadcasting Corporation's regional station, and the headquarters of a full military district had simply gone silent. In Tokyo, they noticed the silence slowly. The first signs came through the Kure naval base, about 12 miles south of Hiroshima. Kure had felt the shockwave. Kure had seen the cloud. Kure had a working radio, and Kure began calling Tokyo. The reports were fragmentary. A tremendous flash of light, a pillar of smoke rising to unknown altitude, fires visible across the mountain. The reports reached the Naval General Staff by early afternoon. They were passed to Admiral Toyoda's desk. Toyoda read them. He said, in a voice that would be remembered by the staff officer who brought them, "This is exaggeration. The regional command panics." He put the reports aside. He was not, in that moment, being stupid. He was doing what he had been trained to do. Japanese intelligence, throughout the war, had learned to distrust panic. Local commanders exaggerated. Regional reports inflated. The professional discipline of a general staff was to wait for confirmation. To wait for a second source. To wait for photographs. The problem was that there were no photographs. There would be no photographs for another 24 hours. Because the reconnaissance aircraft that Toyoda ordered dispatched, sometime after 2 in the afternoon, would not reach Hiroshima until dusk. And when they did, they would find something the pilots did not have vocabulary to describe. But we are getting ahead of the story. At noon on the 6th of August, the Big Six had not been convened. There was no emergency meeting. There was no red alert. There was, in the bunker beneath the Imperial Palace, only the slow accumulation of fragments, a cloud, a flash, a silence. And a single question that no one yet knew how to ask. To understand why they did not know how to ask it, we have to go back. Not far. Just to a man who had been dead for 2 years and 4 months. A man whose voice in that summer of 1945 still echoed in the corridors of the Naval General Staff. Even the men who had ignored him could still hear him. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto. In the summer of 1919, Yamamoto had arrived at Harvard University. He was 35 years old, a junior naval officer. He carried a suitcase and a letter of introduction. He would spend the next 2 years learning English by reading American newspapers. He rode third-class trains across the American continent. He saw Chicago. He saw Detroit. He saw the oil fields of Texas. In 1926, on a second tour as naval attaché, he walked through the Ford Motor Company's River Rouge plant. It was the largest integrated factory in the world. Iron ore went in one end. Automobiles came out the other. Yamamoto stood on a mezzanine and looked down at the assembly lines and did what a naval officer does when facing something he does not understand. He counted. He counted the windows. He counted the doors. He counted the chimneys, the rail sidings, the workers he could see. He made estimates in a small notebook. He calculated production capacity, and when he returned to the Imperial Japanese Navy, he wrote a report. The report said, in essence, that any war between Japan and the United States would be decided not on the sea, but in factories like the one in River Rouge. It said that Japan could not build such factories. It said that even if Japan won every battle, Japan would lose the war. The report was filed. It was archived. It was forgotten. 15 years later, in September of 1940, Yamamoto was summoned to a meeting with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe. Konoe wanted to know, from the man who would have to command the combined fleet, what would happen if Japan went to war with America. Yamamoto's answer has been preserved in the naval staff records. He said, "If I am told to fight in the first 6 months to a year of a war against the United States and England, I will run wild. I will show you an uninterrupted succession of victories, but I must also tell you that if the war be prolonged for 2 or 3 years, I have no confidence in our ultimate victory." Kono listened. Kono did nothing. Yamamoto went home. He wrote letters to friends. In one letter later recovered, he said that any officer who advocated war with America should be sent to walk the streets of Detroit. Not to spy, not to plan, to count windows. As he had counted windows, no one was sent to Detroit. And in December of 1941, Yamamoto, who understood better than any man alive that Japan could not defeat the United States in a long war, personally designed and executed the attack on Pearl Harbor. This is the first hard truth of our story. The man who understood American power most clearly, the man who had walked American factories and calculated American production, was the man who lit the fuse. Not because he was foolish, because he was obedient. He believed that if war was coming, and it was, then Japan's only hope was a shattering first blow that might force America to negotiate before her industry could mobilize. He was wrong. He knew he might be wrong. He did it anyway. Yamamoto died in April of 1943, shot down over Bougainville by American fighters who had decoded his flight schedule. 2 years before Hiroshima. His death was itself proof of the gap he had warned about. The Japanese Navy did not believe, could not accept, that the Americans were reading their most secret codes. The evidence was there. The evidence had always been there. They had chosen not to see it. This was the pattern. This was the disease. Japanese military intelligence throughout the war produced accurate reports, sober assessments, careful calculations of American production. And those reports were suppressed, not by censors, not by the enemy, by the officers whose careers depended on optimism. In the summer of 1945, the head of Army intelligence was Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue. He was 50 years old. A professional intelligence officer. His second bureau had, over the course of the war, produced increasingly desperate briefings about American industrial capacity. American aircraft production had exceeded 300,000 units. American shipyards were launching escort carriers on a schedule of 1 per week. American war production at its peak had exceeded the combined output of every other nation on Earth. Arisu's team knew these numbers. His team could recite them. His team was not permitted to brief the Big Six. Anami, the war minister, had personally instructed that morale-damaging intelligence was to be filtered before it reached the Supreme Council. The Prime Minister was to be spared. The Emperor was to be spared. The Chiefs of Staff were to be spared. What they were being spared from was the truth. This is the second hard truth. Japan did not lose because Japan did not know. Japan lost, in part, because Japan had built an information system that treated knowledge as treason. The reports existed. The men who had written them still walked the halls of the Ministry of War, past offices where their reports were locked in safes, marked secret, waiting for the war to end so that the archives could be burned. By late afternoon on the 6th of August, the reports from Kure had thickened. A civilian train arrived at a station outside Hiroshima carrying passengers with burns, unlike any burns Japanese medicine had catalogued. Skin hanging like wet cloth, eyes clouded, a railway official was interviewed. He had been about 10 miles from the city. He described the flash as brighter than 1,000 suns. That phrase, brighter than 1,000 suns, would enter Japanese official records for the first time that afternoon. It was not poetry. It was the language of a man trying to describe something for which no language existed. Foreign Minister Togo received a summary from a subordinate at 5 p.m. He read it. He asked for confirmation. There was no confirmation to be had. The military had not yet issued a formal report. The reconnaissance aircraft had not returned. The wire services had not yet moved. Togo went home. He ate dinner with his wife. He slept. Prime Minister Suzuki received his summary later that evening. He read it. He said nothing. He did not call an emergency meeting. He did not summon the Big Six. He did not go to the Emperor. He waited. Everyone waited. The confirmation came at last. It came exactly as we said from the enemy's radio. At approximately 7 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of August, the Domei News Agency's monitoring station intercepted a shortwave broadcast from Washington. President Harry Truman had made a statement 16 hours earlier. The statement was now being rebroadcast on American radio and by the BBC. Dome's translators sat down at their desks and began to render the English into Japanese. The words they wrote were these: the Americans had dropped on the city of Hiroshima an atomic bomb, harnessing the basic power of the universe, the force from which the sun draws its power. A reign of ruin, Truman said, was coming to Japan, the like of which had never been seen on this earth. The Dome translation was rushed to the Foreign Ministry, from there to the Prime Minister's office, from there to the bunker beneath the palace. At the moment the news reached him, Admiral Toyoda was in his office at Naval General Staff. He read the translation. He said, according to a staff officer present, the Americans have made propaganda. There cannot be such a bomb. If it were possible, we would have built it ourselves. He did not know that they had tried, that in a laboratory outside Tokyo, a physicist named Yoshio Nishina had led a program for 4 years to build exactly such a weapon. That the program had been called NIGO, that it had failed for lack of enriched uranium, that within 72 hours, Nishina would be walking through the ruins of Hiroshima. That within 4 days, he would tell the Army Chief of Staff, on paper, that the Americans had done what Japan had tried and failed to do. But that is part 2 of our story. For now, at the end of the 16 hours, on the morning of the 7th of August, the ruling council of the Empire of Japan had learned, from a radio broadcast in a language they had spent 4 years dismissing, that the war they thought they were fighting was not the war they were fighting. They did not yet believe it. Some of them would never believe it. But the silence had ended. The morning of the 7th of August, 1945, arrived in Tokyo with heat and humidity and the sound of cicadas in the ruined trees. The city had been burning, on and off, for 5 months. Everyone who could leave had left. Those who remained lived on rice rations that had been cut, and cut again, and cut a 3rd time. The old men in the ministries wore uniforms that hung loose on their shoulders. The women had stopped putting up their hair. The children had stopped playing in the streets, because there were no streets left in some districts, only paths through ash. Into this city, that morning, came the news from the American radio. The Dome translation of President Truman's statement was carried by motorcycle courier from the Foreign Ministry to the Prime Minister's official residence. It was carried from there to the bunker beneath the Imperial Palace. It was handed to Prime Minister Suzuki. He read it once. He read it again. He set it on his desk. You have to picture him, 77 years old. A man who had commanded a torpedo boat in the war against Russia 40 years earlier. A man who had been shot 3 times in his own home by young officers of the 26th of February incident of 1936. The bullets had been removed. 1 fragment remained. It lived near his heart. When the weather changed, he could feel it. He had been chosen for this office in April because the emperor believed he was the only man alive who could tell the army to stand down and be obeyed. He had accepted the position with the understanding that his job was to end the war. He had never said this aloud. He had never said this to the Big Six. He had said it in a single private meeting, only to the emperor and to Marquis Koichi Kido, the Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal. Kido was 55 years old. He kept a diary. That diary would, in later decades, become one of the most important documents of the 20th century. On the morning of the 7th of August, Kido wrote in that diary a single line about the atomic bomb. It said, "The situation has entered a new phase." That was all, in a language that specialized in restraint, in a diary written by a man who had watched his empire consume itself. This was the sound of the ceiling giving way. Kido went to see the emperor at 11 in the morning. Hirohito was 44 years old. He was a small man, nearsighted, a marine biologist by inclination, an emperor by inheritance and by the will of men who had used his name to start a war he had signed onto but had never quite chosen. He listened to Kido. He set down his tea. He said, according to Kido's diary, that under the circumstances they must bow to the inevitable. That phrase, bow to the inevitable, was the closest the emperor had come, in nearly 4 years of war, to admitting that Japan had lost. But the emperor did not, and could not, end the war by himself. The constitution of the Empire of Japan did not permit it. The emperor reigned, the cabinet ruled, the Big Six advised, and the Big Six, as of that morning, had not been convened. For 2 more days they would not meet. Why? Because they did not agree on what had happened, because Toyoda, the Navy Chief of Staff, insisted the bomb was propaganda. Because Anami, the War Minister, insisted that even if it was real, the Americans could only have one. Because Umezu, the Army Chief of Staff, insisted that the war on the home islands would be won by ground troops, not by bombs. Because the machinery of Japanese government required consensus, and there was no consensus, and no one wanted to be the first to break. So they waited, and on the 8th of August, the confirmation began to arrive. Lieutenant General Seizo Araisue, the head of Army Intelligence, flew to Hiroshima on the morning of the 8th. With him went a small team of officers and one sim scientist, an assistant to Yoshio Nishina. They landed at a small airfield south of what had been the city. They drove in as far as they could. They walked the rest. What Arasu saw would enter his official reports over the coming days. Concrete buildings sheared off at their foundations, streetcars fused to their tracks, a shadow on a stone wall that was, on closer inspection, a person. The pilot who had flown him in reported updrafts strong enough to lift the aircraft 2,000 feet in seconds. The temperatures at altitude had exceeded anything in his instruments. Arasu was not a physicist, but he had studied intelligence for 30 years, and he knew what he was looking at. On the evening of the 8th, from a field radio at the edge of the destruction zone, he sent a preliminary cable to the Army General Staff in Tokyo. The cable said, in effect, that the American claim was true, that the weapon was of a type Japan did not possess, that the destruction was, in the strict military sense, total. That cable reached General Umezu's desk before dawn on the 9th of August. He read it, he put it in a folder. He went to the meeting of the Big Six that morning at 10:30, and he said nothing about it. Yoshio Nishina himself would fly to Hiroshima a day later. He would walk through the ruins with a small radiation meter he had built by hand. He would kneel by the vaporized roof tiles, whose upper surfaces had been turned to a thin layer of glass by temperatures no conventional bomb could produce. He would file his final scientific confirmation on the 10th of August. Uranium-235, what they had tried to build, what the Americans had built. What Nishina, Japan's greatest physicist, had understood on sight. But before Nishina's confirmation, before even the Big Six had convened on the 9th, another failure was unfolding 2,000 miles to the west. Ambassador Naotake Sato was 62 years old, a career diplomat. He had been serving in Moscow for over 3 years, in a posting that had become an exercise in slow humiliation. His government had instructed him over and over to sound out the Soviets about mediating a peace settlement. He had done so over and over. He had been received politely. He had been given nothing. He was not, in fact, a fool. Sato had written back to Tokyo, in cables that survive in the archives, telling his government the truth. The Soviets would not mediate. The Soviets were preparing to enter the war. His superiors in Tokyo had ignored him, because ignoring him was easier than accepting what he was saying. On the 6th of August, hours after Hiroshima, Sato requested an urgent meeting with Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. He was told that Molotov was unavailable. He was offered an appointment for the 8th. He accepted. On the afternoon of the 8th of August, at 5 o'clock Moscow time, Sato was received at the Kremlin. Molotov was there, so was an interpreter, so were several aides. Sato entered the room and bowed. He was preparing to present in careful diplomatic Japanese the outlines of the peace overture Konoe had proposed weeks earlier. He did not get the chance. Molotov did not sit down. Molotov did not offer tea. Molotov held a document in his hand. He began to read. The document was the Soviet declaration of war against Japan. It stated that as of the 9th of August, the Soviet Union would consider itself in a state of war with the Empire of Japan. Sato listened. When Molotov had finished, Sato, who had spent his entire career in the service of a country that had just been destroyed, said one thing. He thanked the foreign minister, in Russian, for the many courtesies he had received during his time in Moscow. He bowed. He left. He returned to the Japanese embassy. He drafted an urgent cable to Tokyo. He handed it to his cipher clerk. The cable never arrived. Soviet authorities had, at the moment the meeting began, cut all diplomatic communications between the Japanese embassy and the outside world. Sato would sit in Moscow for hours, not knowing that his own government had already learned of the Soviet declaration through other channels. Because the other channels were the tanks. At 1 minute after midnight on the 9th of August, along a 1,000-mile front stretching from the Amur River to the Sea of Japan, 1.5 million Soviet soldiers crossed the border into Japanese-held Manchuria. More than 5,000 tanks, nearly 4,000 aircraft. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky in overall command, forces that had, 4 months earlier, been destroying Nazi Germany. They fell on the Kwantung Army, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Army, now a hollowed-out force of second-line troops with obsolete equipment. In the first 24 hours, Soviet armored columns advanced 50 miles. The Kwantung Army began to disintegrate. The news reached Tokyo before dawn. And here is what you have to understand. If you understand nothing else about the Japanese High Command, the news of the Soviet invasion, arriving in the pre-dawn darkness of the 9th of August, shocked the Japanese army more than the atomic bomb. Not because it killed more people. It did not. Not because it destroyed more cities. It did not. Because it destroyed the strategy. The strategy was called Ketsugo, decisive operation. It had been designed over the previous year as it became clear that the war could not be won in the conventional sense. Ketsugo assumed that the Americans would have to invade the home islands to occupy Japan. It assumed that the invasion would fall on the beaches of Kyushu. It assumed that when the Americans came ashore, they would meet resistance so fierce, casualties so terrible, that the American public would demand a negotiated peace. The strategy did not aim for victory. It aimed for a settlement in which Japan would keep her emperor, would try her own war criminals, would disarm herself, and would not be occupied. A settlement in which, at the end, Japan could pretend she had not been defeated. For this strategy to work, one thing was required. Time. Time for the Americans to slow down. Time for the diplomatic channel to Moscow to bear fruit. Time for the terrifying casualty projections of an invasion to sink in on the American home front. The Soviet declaration of war destroyed all of it. There would be no mediation. There would be no diplomatic channel. There would be a second front on the mainland of Asia that Japan could not defend. And when the Red Army finished with Manchuria, in a matter of weeks, it would be coming for Hokkaido. The atomic bomb was a weapon. The Soviet declaration was a strategic annihilation. In the bunker beneath the Imperial Palace, at 10:30 in the morning on the 9th of August, the Big Six finally met. They sat around a long wooden table. The room was hot. The ventilation was poor. 6 men in uniforms damp with sweat faced each other across 3 days of accumulated silence. Prime Minister Suzuki opened the meeting. He said that the situation, following the Soviet declaration and the atomic bombing, could not continue. He said that the government must accept the Potsdam Declaration. Foreign Minister Togo agreed. He proposed a single condition, that the position of the emperor be preserved. Navy Minister Yonai agreed. He had opposed the war since 1940. He was at last being heard. 3 men on the side of peace. War Minister Anami spoke next. He said that the war could still be fought, that the atomic bomb was terrible, but Japan had endured terrible bombings before. That the Soviet declaration was serious, but the Soviets lacked the naval capacity to invade the home islands. That the Americans could not have many atomic bombs, because if they had, they would have used them already. He proposed 4 conditions to accept the Potsdam Declaration: preservation of the imperial system, Japanese responsibility for disarming her own forces, Japanese responsibility for trying her own war criminals, no occupation of Japan. Army Chief of Staff Umezu agreed with Anami. He agreed while carrying, in the inner pocket of his uniform tunic, a folded cable from Arisu that told him Anami was wrong. Navy Chief of Staff Toyoda agreed with Anami. 3 men on the side of continued war, 3 and 3, deadlock. They argued through the morning. They argued through the early afternoon. The room grew hotter. At approximately 11 in the morning, an aide entered the room and handed a note to Umezu. Umezu read it. His face did not change. He passed it to Anami, to Toyoda. He passed it finally to Suzuki. The note said that at 2 minutes after 11, that morning, a second atomic bomb had been dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Umezu, holding the note in his hand, said the words that would be remembered. He said, "I can say with confidence that we will be able to destroy the major part of an invading force." He said this after receiving confirmation that the Americans had a second bomb, after receiving Arisu's cable from Hiroshima, after being informed that a second city had just been erased. He said it because he had to, because to say anything else would be to admit that his entire professional life, that his signature on the orders that had authorized the horrors of the Kwantung Army, that his years of service to the emperor had been in service of a war that could not be won. He could not say those words, so he said the other words instead. The meeting continued. Nothing was resolved. By late evening, it had become clear to Prime Minister Suzuki that the Big Six would not, could not, break their deadlock. Consensus was impossible. The machinery of Japanese government had, at the very moment it needed to work, ceased to function. And so Suzuki did something no Prime Minister of Japan had done in the modern era. He arranged, through Marquis Kido, for an imperial conference. A Gozen Kaigi, a meeting held in the presence of the emperor, and at that meeting, if the Big Six could not agree, the emperor himself would speak. This had never been done. In the constitution of the Empire of Japan, the emperor was above politics. He did not decide. He reigned. He was, in a phrase that had governed Japanese political life for 80 years, a symbol, not an actor. Suzuki was going to break that. He was going to ask the emperor to act, and he had cleared it in a private meeting earlier that day with the emperor himself. The conference was set for late that night. In the bunker, 90 feet down, under fluorescent lights, in a room that was too small for what was about to happen. The men arrived one by one: Suzuki, Togo, Yonai, Anami, Umezu, Toyoda, plus Baron Kichiro Hiranuma, president of the Privy Council, added as a technical requirement for a conference in the imperial presence. Plus various secretaries and adjutants standing against the walls. At just before midnight on the 9th of August, going into the 10th, the emperor entered. Hirohito was dressed in the uniform of a generalissimo of the imperial army, olive drab, boots, a sword at his side. He walked to the head of the table and sat down. The prime minister presented the situation. He said the deadlock could not be broken by the ordinary means. He said he was compelled, with the deepest reluctance, to ask His Majesty for guidance. The ministers presented their positions. Togo for peace with the single condition, Anami for war or peace with the 4 conditions, Umezu supporting Anami, Yonai supporting Togo. Toyoda supporting Anami, Hiranuma, when asked, spoke for peace, but with a lawyer's caution about the imperial system. 3 and 3 still. Suzuki rose. He bowed to the emperor. He said the words that had never been said in a modern Japanese imperial conference. He said with the greatest reverence, "I now beg to ask for the imperial decision." The room went silent. Hirohito did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He was, as he had always been, small and quiet and nearsighted. He spoke slowly, and later witnesses would remember that he seemed close to tears. He said that he had reflected upon the situation at home and abroad. He said that continuing the war would mean nothing but the destruction of the nation and a prolongation of bloodshed. He said that he could not bear the thought of his loyal soldiers being disarmed. He could not bear the thought of those who had rendered him faithful service being punished as instigators of the war. But, he said, the time had come to bear the unbearable. He said, "I concur with the proposal of the foreign minister." He stood. He left the room. There was no applause. There was no discussion. The generals, who had spent hours arguing that the war must continue, sat in their chairs and did not move. Anami later that night would be seen with tears on his face. Umezu would say nothing at all. A decision had been made. Not by the Big Six, not by the cabinet, by a man in a general's uniform who was expected to be a symbol and who had just, for the first time in the history of the modern Japanese state, acted like a sovereign. The rest of the war would be about whether that decision would hold. The message went out on the morning of the 10th of August through the Swiss and Swedish diplomatic channels to Washington and London and Moscow and Chongqing. Japan accepted the Potsdam Declaration, subject to a single understanding that the prerogatives of the emperor as a sovereign ruler would not be prejudiced. The Americans took 2 days to answer. When the answer came, on the 12th of August, it was written by Secretary of State James Byrnes in the careful, deliberate language of a man who did not want to promise what he could not deliver. The emperor and the Japanese government would be subject to the authority of the supreme commander of the Allied powers. His ultimate status would be determined by the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. The Byrnes Note. In Tokyo, they read it. And they broke along the same fault lines all over again. Togo said it was acceptable. Suzuki said it was acceptable. Yonai said it was acceptable. Anami said it was not. Anami read the word subject, and he read the phrase will of the people, and he understood, with the intelligence of a man who had spent his whole life inside the imperial army, that the emperor's throne was not guaranteed. That the phrase could mean anything the Americans wanted it to mean. That Japan was being asked to surrender not with a signed promise, but with a hope. He would not sign a hope. On the afternoon of the 13th of August, the Big Six met again, deadlocked again. That night, the Second Imperial Conference was scheduled for the morning of the 14th, and in the ministries and the barracks, in the officer clubs and the war rooms, something began to move that had not moved yet. The young officers of the Ministry of War, the men in their 30s and 40s who had spent their careers preparing to die for the emperor, began to talk to each other about what could be done. Their leader was a major named Kenji Hatanaka. He was 33 years old, thin, intense, brilliant, a staff officer in the military affairs section. He had a face that would look in the surviving photographs like a schoolboy's. He was, by every account that survives, a sincere man. He believed that the surrender was a mistake. He believed that the emperor had been manipulated by the peace faction. He believed that if the recording of the surrender broadcast, which had not yet been made, could be prevented from reaching the public, then the army could seize control of the government and continue the war. He went to General Anami, not once. Many times he asked the war minister to lead a coup. Anami did not agree. Anami did not disagree. Anami, in the days between the 10th and the 14th of August, gave his young officers a series of answers that were neither yes nor no. He said he would consider. He said the situation was complex. He said that decisions of state were the province of the emperor. He did not report them. He did not stop them. Whether he understood the full scope of what they were planning, historians still debate. What is not debated is that he did not warn the palace. On the morning of the 14th of August, the Second Imperial Conference convened in the bunker. The emperor spoke a second time. He said, again, that the war must end. He said, this time, that he would personally record a broadcast to the nation. He asked the cabinet to prepare the surrender document. He left the room. Anami returned to his ministry. His young officers gathered around him. He told them, in a phrase that would be remembered by everyone who was there, that anyone who disagreed with the imperial decision would have to do so over his dead body. They understood him to be refusing them. Some of them understood him correctly to be granting them permission. That afternoon, in a small studio on the second floor of the Imperial Household Ministry, the Emperor of Japan recorded a speech. He had never done this before. No emperor had ever done this before. His voice had never been heard by his own people. He read from a script written by the cabinet and revised by his own hand. He read it twice into a set of recording lathes onto 2 lacquer discs. He read it in the archaic court Japanese that most of his subjects would find nearly impossible to understand, in a voice that was thin and formal and shaking. He said the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He said the enemy had begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb. He said the time had come to endure the unendurable. The recordings were finished at just past 11 o'clock at night. The lacquer discs were placed in a metal case. The case was hidden in a small safe in the office of a court chamberlain, in a room deep inside the Imperial Household Ministry. They would be broadcast at noon the next day. At approximately the same hour, Major Hatanaka and his conspirators moved. Their plan was crude: take control of the Imperial Guards Division, seal the palace, find and destroy the recordings, prevent the broadcast. Isolate the emperor, force the government to reverse its decision. To do this, they needed the commander of the Imperial Guards Division to join them. His name was Lieutenant General Takeshi Mori. He was 51 years old, a professional officer, a Buddhist. That night, in his office at the Guards headquarters, he was talking with his brother-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel Mishinori Shiraishi, who had just come from Hiroshima and was describing the ruined city. Hatanaka and his officers came to see him just after midnight. They asked him to join the coup. Mori refused. He said the emperor's decision was the emperor's decision. He said the army's duty was to obey. Hatanaka drew his pistol. He shot Mori. Another officer, Captain Shigetaro Ehara, drew his sword and killed Shiraishi. Both men died in that office. Hatanaka then took Mori's official seal, still on the desk, and used it to forge orders to the Imperial Guards Division. The orders directed the guards to seal the palace, to search for the recordings, to arrest any officials who tried to interfere. For several hours in the middle of that night, the palace was under the control of men who had murdered their commanding officer. They searched, they tore apart the offices, they interrogated the palace staff at gunpoint. They did not find the recordings. The recordings were in a safe, in a room, in a wing of the ministry that the searchers did not think to enter. By dawn, the coup was failing. The Eastern District Army commander, General Shizuichi Tanaka, arrived at the palace. He confronted the mutinous officers. He faced them down. He ordered them to disperse. Most of them did. Hatanaka rode a motorcycle to the NHK broadcasting station. He held a pistol to the head of the duty officer. He demanded to make a broadcast to the nation to explain his cause. The broadcaster stalled him. The air raid warning system was sounded, providing a pretext. The moment passed. Hatanaka rode back toward the palace. He stopped at the Imperial Palace Plaza. He got off his motorcycle. He walked to a small patch of grass in front of the moat. He took out his pistol. He shot himself in the forehead. In his pocket was a folded sheet of paper. His death poem. At almost the same hour, In his official residence, General Korechika Anami was preparing to die. He had spent the evening drinking with a small group of adjutants. He had written 2 documents. The first was a formal apology to the emperor. The second was a note that said, "With my death, I humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime." He sat on the tatami floor. He wore a white shirt. He arranged his tools. He performed seppuku, the ritual disembowelment, with a short sword. He did not use a second as tradition required. He did not permit another officer to end his suffering with a killing stroke. He cut himself twice, in the abdomen and in the neck, and he bled to death slowly on the floor of his residence over the course of several hours while the sun rose over Tokyo. He was 58 years old. He was the childhood friend of the emperor he had failed. He was the man who had said 4 days earlier that Japan could still fight. He was, in the end, a man who could not choose between his emperor and his army, and who chose neither. At noon on the 15th of August 1945, the recording of the emperor's speech was broadcast from the NHK studios in Tokyo. It was carried on every radio station in the empire, in the streets of Japanese cities, and on the parade grounds of Japanese army camps in China and Manchuria and Korea. People stopped what they were doing and stood in the sun and listened to a voice they had never heard. It was a strange voice, thin, formal, ancient. Many of them could not understand the archaic language he was using. But they understood the meaning. The war was over. Some of them wept. Some of them knelt. Some of them, in scattered places across the ruined empire, drew their own pistols and their own swords and followed an army into the dark. On the 2nd of September 1945, on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the instrument of surrender. He wore a top hat. He walked with a wooden leg, the result of a bomb attack in Shanghai in 1932. General Yoshijiro Umezu signed after him for the Imperial General Headquarters. Around them in the bay stretched a fleet so large it could not be counted in a single glance. Hundreds of ships, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, fleet oilers, landing craft, and above them formations of American aircraft passed over in waves that filled the sky and blocked the sun. This was a fraction of what the United States could put to sea. This was in a phrase used 19 years earlier at a Ford factory in Detroit, the number of windows. And, in an interview with American historians in December of 1945, 4 months after his government fell, Prime Minister Suzuki said something that captured what the Japanese High Command had, in the end, understood. He said the bomb had shown them that the Americans no longer needed to invade. It had shown them that Ketsu-go, the entire strategy of the final defense, was empty. It had shown them that Japan could be destroyed without ever being touched. Not defeated, erased. They had spent 4 years distancing themselves that American power was a matter of numbers. Of factories, of tonnage, of tanks and planes and shells that could be counted and matched, if not in quantity then in spirit. They had discovered, in a flash brighter than 1,000 suns, that American power was a matter of something else. Of a civilization that could build weapons whose principles Japan's greatest physicist had understood and could not replicate. Of an industrial base that could fight 2 oceans and still hold back. Of a decision made in a laboratory in New Mexico that a Japanese war minister could not answer with a sword. The windows had already been counted. The factories had already been built. The bomb had already been dropped. By then it was already too late.